Hey Dan, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon.
It's nice to see you. I think last time we saw each other, we were in Glasgow, a COP.
Yes, that's correct. I think it was the 11th of November. You came and saw us at the Sidstock and UNIDO Ocean Energy event, which had a big focus on OTEC.
Yeah, that was. I mean, we went to lots of events at COP, and that was one of the highlights for me. Well, because we've been speaking to you for a while, and it was great seeing you up on stage there. But also, there's something very exciting about the technology that you're bringing to market to help bring clean energy to developing island nations. Could you so maybe that's a good place to start. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what is OTEC and how is it helping in the fight against the climate emergency?
Sure. So OTEC stands for Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion, just for any listeners who aren't aware of that. And it's really the principle behind using the temperature difference between warm surface seawater and cold deep water to do work, which could be producing electricity, it could be aquaculture, thermal desalination, or we could go further into the galaxy brain territory of hydrogen, lithium extraction, and other exciting areas. OTEC is a baseload power, unlike a lot of the renewables which are now on the market. They're intermittent, tend to rely on the sun shining or the wind blowing or the moon doing something. That can be supplemented, of course, with battery technology. But then you have some baseload power, clean energy, such as nuclear, geothermal, and ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC. And I think a big application for this is in areas that don't have the required land for like solar installations or even nuclear or geothermal resource. And it could be it's an ocean-based system, an incredibly energy-dense one that can provide islands, coastal areas across the tropics with clean baseload power.
I think that's one thing that's super interesting to me is that it's baseload. You know, unlike solar, unlike wind, it's baseload, i.e., it's just on all the time. And the way that I tell people about this, I don't know if I'm overselling it, but the way that I talk about it is you put a barge out, e.g., a kilometre out to sea, and that will just generate, 1.5 megawatts or something day or night for 30 years. Am I overselling it? Is that roughly it?
No, I think you're selling it well within the way that we are as well. I would just caveat that this is really anywhere that you have a resource of warm surface seawater and cold deep water with a temperature differential, or delta T is the technical term. We need about 20 degrees centigrade of delta T there. So in some areas it may be 1 kilometre offshore. It could be up to maybe 5, even 7. And you're just running a cable to shore to supply that electricity that you're exporting.
It seems like magic, really, that you've got this. If you were to paddle out in your canoe to where these barges are going to be, you wouldn't notice anything really, would you? Except if you kind of dove into the water and dove down, it would slowly start getting colder. But the fact that you've just got this temperature difference and you can generate energy out of that seems bananas. It seems like science fiction.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because actually the concept was first coined by Jules Verne, the author of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and it was a sci-fi concept that you could use the thermal difference to produce energy. And just a few years later in France, Jacques D'Arsenval, a physicist there, actually came up with a concept of how to do this. But aside from the science fiction, anyone listening who's been scuba diving or even snorkeling, you don't have to go very deep in your snorkel gear or your scuba equipment to just suddenly feel a drop in temperature. And that's typically because the sun has to penetrate just slightly further through the surface water to warm up where you might be scubaing around some coral. And it's the same principle, but just extrapolated over a much deeper depth.
If we go swimming in a lake near us, then that lake in summer is going to be warmish, and then in winter it's going to be cold. And so our experience, as landlubbers of temperature, is that it goes up and down a lot. But I understand from what you're saying that That temperature gradient, the delta T, the temperature difference between the surface and a depth, that's there all year round, is it?
Yes, I'd caveat that with there's another phenomenon at play here called the thermohaline cycle, and this is think of the Gulf Stream that you have pushing all the warm air up from the Caribbean to Europe. Well, you also have incredibly deep polar cycles pushing Arctic and Antarctic ice underneath the equator. So you can get some really cold, deep water in certain parts of the world that would be much cooler than a lake or a lagoon, and this really improves the efficiency of the technology.
This might be difficult to Eli 5, but can you explain like I'm 5? What's happening? So you got this temperature differential. Like what we learned at school is hot stuff rises, cool stuff sinks. So convection. What's happening inside an OTEC machine to kind of convert that temperature difference into energy?
Sure. So that warm surface seawater is being pumped into a heat exchanger, which transfers the warm water, the heat within the warm water, to another chamber. Think of it a bit like a radiator warming up another room, and in that other chamber is a working fluid, which is under pressure and boils as a result. And it's sort of like, I like to use this hand boiler as an example, where just the warmth of my hand in this high pressure environment is forcing a liquid up the tube. So
wow,
as that liquid is vaporized, it's spinning a turbine, so that's producing our electricity. Now, to run that cycle consistently, we need to then cool that vapor back into a liquid form, and that's what we use, that cold deep water from around 800 up to 1500 meters below the vessel. That's being pumped up, and that's a heat sink. So the water's going to another heat exchanger, and that's a condenser, which is then condensing that vapor back into a liquid, which is then pumped back into the other heat exchanger. So that's why we've got a cycle there that can run 24/7, 365 days a year.
It is science fiction, but it's slowly becoming. So it's actually quite a simple idea, but I mean, you look at it and you think there's nothing visible happening there, but it's generating energy, and quite a lot of energy, right? What's the kind of, how much energy is it generating, and what can you do with that amount of energy?
Sure, it really depends on the scale of the equipment which you've deployed. So we see the viable entry market of building these small-scale OTEC systems, which can be replicated and almost standardized and mass-produced all over the tropics. And we're really driven by what's commercial, and that commercial sweet spot is around 1.5 to maybe 2.5 megawatts of net installed power.
Net installed power meaning that you need some power that is generated to run the actual system itself.
That's right. So the gross power of one of these systems would be maybe a third higher. So that's to power what we call the parasitic load. So those pumps that are boosting the water up and moving the ammonia around the system, that represents around 30% of the system's operations. So a 1.5 megawatt net output system would have a gross rating of about 2.2 megawatts.
I see. So you've got this this tech. There's lots of things to talk about here. Like how this tech's been around for a while. Why now? Where are you going to take it? How did you get into it? Let's cover all of this. But I think a good place to take this next is where are you starting with all of this? So you've got this technology that's been around for a while. You're going to do kind of one of the first proper commercial installations. Where are you going to start?
That's right. So look, we're standing on the shoulders of giants here, because you can, like I say, go back to the late 1800s when physicists were theorising that there was a practical application here. And I mentioned Jack D'Arsonval earlier. His student, George Claude, in Cuba in the 1930s, actually installed a cold water pipe running down the ocean to kind of show more of a practical application rather than just a theoretical application that this cycle works. Fast forward to 1979, Jimmy Carter passes the Ocean Thermal Energy Act with a huge push for OTEC to be a big contributor to the energy mix in the US. But Unfortunately, Reagan came in just a couple of years after this, and I don't think the investment in energy R&D has ever recovered to the point which he cut. But that inspired a cohort of really smart and tenacious engineers back then who spent most of their careers developing OTEC. And around the time they were retiring, these engineers managed to have an OTEC plant operational, one in Hawaii in the USA, and the other in one of the most southern islands of Japan, called Kumajima Island. So at these plants, we've had 100 kilowatt pilots demonstrated, but no one's been able to take OTEC across the valley of death out of the early stage government and grant funded application over to the commercial scale up application. I think a lot of focus was put on the wrong scale for this. So Lockheed Martin, from the 90s through to around 2014, 2015, invested a lot of time and government money in designing these 50 to 100 megawatt scale systems. They thought that was the first of a kind commercial system scale, which now, with the benefit of hindsight coming in now, you look at other technologies that have scaled up, whether it's in wind, solar or geothermal. These systems have started at a much smaller and easier to wrap your head around scales. So we saw this back in 2014, 2015 when we first started thinking about OTEC. We just couldn't understand why there hadn't really been a small-scale application. I started speaking to people who had been OTEC engineers their entire lives, academics that had studied OTEC for their whole of their careers. There just wasn't really a good enough answer apart from, it wouldn't really be commercial at that scale. So I guess I'm getting into the story now of how we got to where we are. So we thought we wanted our own data to judge this. So we had the concept of a small scale system around 1.5 megawatts, and we saw that there was a huge island market across the tropics. I'd say about 45 to 50 of the world's islands, both small island developing states and overseas territories, that could be benefiting from this equipment, but instead they're stuck on dirty diesel imports, spending up to 40 or 50 cents per kilowatt hour on their electricity, without the space for solar, without the resource of wind, tidal or anything else that's nearer the market. So we raised some grant money and angel investment. We completed a preliminary design, concept design, and started modelling what the cost would be for this system. And we were staggered by the results. Our modelling found that a first of a kind system that isn't even mass produced would be able to provide a cost per kilowatt hour of around 20 cents per kilowatt hour for this market. So there's a cost saving, it's almost cutting the electricity costs in half of these pristine islands around the world that are relying on the Middle East, the US and the other oil giants for diesel imports. And I guess I can't quite remember exactly where your question was leading me with this, but that's sort of the background that kind of gets us to where we are in the present day.
Okay, so there's lots of places around the world that this might work, but there's kind of a sweet spot with small island developing nation states, in that so you mentioned earlier that they've got not very much land, but they've got lots of sea around them. So that is all of their territory, all of this sea land. So anything that they can do in the sea is much more palatable. You mentioned something about the cost of energy so how are these nations generating their energy at the moment? You said it's a lot more expensive than OTEC itself will be able to provide.
That's right. I mean, they're almost exclusively diesel powered, with the exception of some islands who are blessed with a tidal resource, a hydroelectric resource, such as Fiji. Just to get back to your point about the area of ocean which they govern, on average, islands have 28 times more ocean space which they govern than land. You could fit Saudi Arabia in the exclusive economic zone of Mauritius. This ocean's just being used for some scuba diving for tourists, some fishing, and the land is incredibly under stress. It's providing agriculture, the public infrastructure works. it's a biosphere. So the idea that these beautiful, pristine places are going to knock down their biospheres and lay concrete for solar panels is just something that they're not willing to do.
I remember some of these heads of state talking about this. We should get onto how you managed to get all of these heads of state together. but some of them saying that so they have to choose, right, between leaving it as rainforest or chopping it down to grow food or doing energy. And it seems like all three of those things are very valuable. We don't want to chop down any rainforest.
No, absolutely, and for these islands, a lot of their GDP is coming from tourism. So the idea that they're going to replace beautiful, lush rainforests with solar panels, that's not going to keep their economies, running in the same way as before. So they've been holding out for an alternative solution. They've been hearing about OTEC for well over a decade now. And again, standing on the shoulders of giants, I've been working with OTEC pioneers who are at the end of their careers. They've been trying to further the agenda for OTEC in the small islands, and they've finally started to see traction for the first time in decades of trying, probably through a combination of the current agenda and the urgency of climate change, the additional climate finance capital that's becoming available for these higher risk projects, and the maturity of the components. So only in the last 4 or 5 years have we had these demonstration plants for OTEC available, de-risking the material choices of the heat exchangers, de-risking the cycle. So there's the answer to your why now question wrapped into that as well.
So you a while ago discovered this thing called OTEC. You started doing some modelling with some people who were very experienced in this area, and you realised that these islands are a great place to start. What did you do then? Because if you fast forward to present day, when I came up with you to COP, I saw all of these heads of state talking about A, how great OTEC was, and B, how your company was going to be a key partner for them. And it was ludicrous, really. There's the Prime Minister of Tonga was there. There were people from heads of state from places like the Seychelles, Sao Tome and Principe. I met the Minister for Energy. It's how did you go from being like a guy in a bedroom reading a book about OTEC to making all of this happen? I suppose let me carry on with the plug for a sec, because it's not just heads of state. You've also got experts in OTEC, and then you've got experts in kind of marine engineering and building very large scale marine installations. How have you managed to bring all of these together?
So there's one key thing you may have recalled from my speech at COP, Pete, and that was that partnerships were the key thing in bringing this all together. So I guess you have to go back to 2017 when we first incorporated the company. We saw the Maldives as an ideal entry market for us. So 130 resort islands, 186 Maldivian local islands. We thought at the time this was the best place in the world to deploy OTEC, even if you are sandwiched by 2 monsoon zones. It seemed to capture the interest of investors, and our team loved it. So that was kind of our entry market. I managed to get 5 MOUs, memorandums of understanding, signed with various resort owners, including the Hilton, Lux, some of the really big resorts there. One of these has an underwater restaurant on their resort. So scale and ambition is something which these islands love. So we thought there was a really good fit there. We started to get some traction with the Maldivian government for the requisite environmental studies and understanding the legislation there. And unfortunately, March 2020 came around. I just returned from signing an MOU then with the largest private company in the Maldives. They wanted to roll OTEC out across a number of their resorts. And, 21st of March, I think it was, I had a WhatsApp from the owner's son saying, our resorts are now temporary quarantine facilities. We're going to have to, put the deal off indefinitely. Let's touch bases soon. And that was a real gut punch. I remember exactly where I was at the time when I got that message. So we had a couple of choices. We could, and going back to the putting our March 2020 hats on, we could have just waited for COVID to blow over. Maybe this will be a passing thing that will be gone in 3 to 6 months, or we could pivot, which is a typical catchphrase in the startup world. Now, aside from just being focused on the Maldives, I had constantly been, trying to have leads or contacts in other parts of the world. I had been pitching to ministers in the Turks and Caicos Islands, the Cayman Islands, a number of different overseas territories. And there was one organisation recognised by the UN that represents a whole cohort of, I think, 32 small island developing states. And I thought, right, well, instead of having to have 32 pitches and go through 32 different channels of communication, maybe we can forge a partnership with one that represents all of these. I was thrilled to find that this organisation is called SIDSTOC. I was thrilled to find at the SIDSTOC assembly just before I contacted them, their members had put in a treaty that OTEC was a priority technology for them. So it felt like a real synergy for us to be able to work together there. Now, the benefit of working on a public or a public utilities project compared to the Maldives when you're maybe working with the Hilton or a hotel chain is that many more pools of capital are open to you. So these could be grants, blended finance facilities, concessionary finance facilities. And we've realised that actually we're expanding the pie, I guess, by doing a public-private partnership, that we're going to be involving a lot of these different institutions that are designed for de-risking these projects and scaling up, projects that catalyse sustainable development across these markets. So that conversation, I think, happened around mid-2020 with the SIDSTOC, and by July 2021, we had a memorandum of understanding negotiated on how we were going to work together in mobilising finances and resources into accelerating the deployment of our OTEC technology across this market.
Amazing. What a great story. I never fail to be amazed by how much traction you've managed to gain in all of this time. And I think I've only just now realised that you've done like the lion's share of this during COVID, which is pretty amazing.
Well, there hasn't been much else to do, Pete.
That's true.
But can I just give you an alternative answer to that previous point you made? So there hasn't been a lot to do, Pete. But what I think COVID has done is it's really normalised Zoom and video conferencing and doing deals in a way that before you just had to get on a plane and be in the same room with people for. So I think that's really actually provided some tailwinds into us building relationships with these organisations that would be very focused around their events calendar. So that's kind of democratised startups with very little money from being able to get in the room with these decision makers.
I think there's a few things to drill into there. I think the one thing you mentioned about partnerships being really key to all of this. I think now we're in a time where lots of people are motivated to make a big difference, and they're looking for ways in which they can get involved. And when I read the book about big organising, which anyone who's trying to make anything big happen should read, it makes this statement that so many people in the world are waiting for you to ask them to do something big. And so you're coming along saying there's this really big idea. It could have all of this great impact in the world. Do you want to be involved? And really, it's just finding the organisations, the people around the world that are needed, bringing them together rather than having to do it all yourself, which is the magic, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it reminds me of something from one of the most formative books for me that I've read by Peter Diamandis called Abundance. It's about appearing above the line of super credibility. So, you think about me coming into this space in 2015, 2016 as working in sales marketing for e-commerce and various luxury fashion brands, to then suddenly being, someone who was going to commercialize an ocean energy technology. I think to be recognized as someone who was going to be able to pull that off, I needed a piece of expertise around the table. And I do remember that, quite early on, people would ask, what do you bring into this? You don't have an engineering background. You're not from money. Why are you here? And, once you start to build a team of people who can do amazing things, you realize that's what you're there to do. You're there to build the team, to set the brief and solve the problem. And I think that's something that I've just come to realize a little more recently than I did before.
So in 5 years' time, let's say in 10 years' time, if you get to where you want to get to, how is it all going to be different? How this band of paradise islands around the equator and around the tropics, how's life going to be different for them?
Yeah, so in 10 years' time, the standard form of energy across the small island developing states and overseas territories is going to be ocean thermal energy conversion. It's going to catalyse sustainable development and bring them energy security, allowing them not to be affected by whatever geopolitics are happening off Iran or in the US or with Russia. I think they're really going to be able to build a secure society. Something I quite like to tell people new to this is that sea level rises isn't going to be what destroys small islands. Their economies are going to collapse and become untenable, triggering a mass movement of people to the developed world, or the more secure world, should we call it. That's going to happen long before these islands are swallowed up by the Hollywood-style tidal waves coming in. And these islands are already seeing a brain drain. So I think what we want to try and do is show that these islands can be secure places to thrive and build and develop and retain talent. And that's what I think OTEC is going to be a real catalyst in achieving.
You mentioned kind of the geopolitical angle here. So this is not just about generating energy. Could you just expand on the geopolitical side of things?
Yeah, so it's very much about energy security. So let's use, for example, the 07, 08, financial crisis, having a knock-on effect to oil prices. Some islands in the Pacific were paying over $1 per kilowatt hour for their electricity. $1. I appreciate in Europe we're experiencing a bit of a crisis firsthand for us, but we're a developed nation. We have legislation and financial backstops to help the people deal with it. This is islands that are incredibly remote places who haven't been able to enjoy a lot of the prosper which we've had.
Could you just, what do you mean 1 kilowatt, $1 per kilowatt hour? What is a kilowatt hour, and what do we pay? What am I paying for my lights right now?
A kilowatt hour is a unit of electricity. So this is how we get billed. This is how we bill around the world for electricity. So I think in the UK we're maybe around 30 cents per kilowatt hour. If you look at a standard or over a few year period, we're probably around 20 to 30 cents per kilowatt hour. If you go over to the US, you go to Texas or California, electricity is incredibly cheap. It's more around 10 or 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So it feels incredibly hard to justify the Californians and Texans are paying 10% of the electricity cost that people on remote islands are. So part of that is in the choice, the dominant choice, or the only choice of electricity they have being diesel. Part of that's in the logistics of shipping the diesel over really long distances. And another part of that is how diesel or oil prices react to global events like, attacks on tankers happening off the coast of Iran, or financial crises caused very far away from where they are. So I think they see one of the key ways for them to develop and prosper is to cut that dependence on diesel and really seal their own fate with energy from their doorstep.
So you're just closing a round of funding at the moment. What I understand from my inside sources, what happens next, right? When you've done that, what's next? What does 2022 look like for Global OTEC?
Yeah, so 2022 is really focused around a pre-feasibility study of our entry market, which is Sao Tome and Principe. It's the most beautiful small island which you've never heard of. Not you in particular, Pete. You've obviously been shaking hands with their Minister of Energy alongside us, but for your listeners, it's a beautiful island off the coast of Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, and it has the highest concentration of endemic species found anywhere in the world. So its nickname is the Galapagos of Africa. They have 30 megawatts of installed diesel capacity, aging generators, and a really young population. So the funding which we're raising, combined with a grant which we've been awarded by the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, is going to look into all the fundamental properties of that environment and how that will affect the design of our base case OTEC platform. And around Q2 or maybe Q3 at a push, we intend to have a letter of intent or another memorandum of understanding, but this time with the government of Sao Tome and Principe, to replace their diesel generators with OTEC at a mutually agreeable price point for a set duration. So that's our plan.
Great. So I think having spent a while reading about your story and your progress, it seems that this first barge is where it's all at, because once you pull off one barge, so Sao Tome and Principe sign power purchase agreements or whatever, saying yes, if you can build this barge, we'll buy the energy from you, and you build a floating global OTEC barge, then that's it. You're away, then, aren't you? All of a sudden, purchase orders come in from around the world saying, "Oh, could you build 6 for us?"
Yes, the reason it's really hard now is that we can't access the same project finance that other renewables get. So we need a demonstrator, we need a track record, and that's why we're going for this commercial scale system, because with 2 years of operational data from that, we expect we'll be able to start to access that project finance, which is a much bigger pool of capital. And that really gets us away. We want to license this technology to developers all around the world. We want to supply them with OTEC barges, and we want to see this as the fastest growing technology across the tropics.
There's something about the fact that there's something about your ambition here, isn't there? Which great startups that we're super excited about have something in common, which is the scale of their ambition. And there seems to be something about if you think big, then that kind of starts to generate, and you talk big and you start to believe something very hard, then other people start to believe it too, and you've got this kind of self-fulfilling thing where you've got this big dream, other people start to have this big dream, people who can make things happen start to have this big dream, people who can pay for big things to happen start to have this dream, and then voila, all of a sudden it starts to become reality. What you're doing is reality. It's happening, isn't it? We hear prime ministers talking about it, we hear the UN talking about it, we see you on stage at COP. You had to start with that ambition, didn't you? You couldn't say, "Listen, I want to make one in my bathtub." Where did that ambition come from? Have you always had it? Has it kind of developed over time?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't know if I've thought that deeply about the answer. I think if you look at maybe my track record, I wasn't particularly good in school, so I wasn't getting the praise or the recognition that some people thrive on to do well in life. So I kind of meandered around some different industries that I thought I wanted to work in, like music and live events. I think the most ambitious thing I did when I was around 14 or 15 years old was to just book a bunch of bands to play a gig up in Colchester in Essex, and I started promoting that on MySpace, and it was a huge success. And I know that sounds like it's a million miles away from an OTEC barge floating out off of the coast of Sao Tome and Principe, but I think what the parallels are of like getting out of this mental model that just says toe the line, become a lawyer, a doctor, or accountant, and there's nothing wrong with any of those professions. Just I don't think everybody is made for them, and I think stepping out of my comfort zone for the first time back when I was 14 or 15 really set me up to aim a bit higher, and I think I'm lucky to have made that leap then to be who I am now.
Right, so let's wrap up with we're all here fighting the climate emergency, and I think we're here because we're kind of cautiously optimistic about our chances of pulling it off. Do you ever think about like the world in 2050? If we pull off all of the things that we need to pull off to get to net zero by then, to not just stop global warming from happening, but to enter drawdown, we'll be having all of these tertiary and secondary effects, like you bringing energy security to Paradise Islands. What's the world going to be like? Do you ever think about that?
Yes, I think it's a huge shift to nature-based solutions. It's a moratorium in putting anything out of the ground. I think nuclear and geothermal in the right places around the world are going to be huge providers of energy, and I think without getting too anarchistic, I think there's going to be a huge change in the world that we know, the framework of things. We're going to have to let go of commoditizing certain products, whether that be food, water, or energy. And I think we're going to have, as a result of that, a far more abundant and prosperous world for everyone. But we have to step back from the idea that we can extract value from the earth, package it up, and put a label on it, and try and find a mass market for it. I think that's what is going to be a lot more local. I think it's going to be a lot more locally produced. So again, maybe an anti-globalist point there as well.
Yeah, we've been hearing that from a lot of people. Actually, there's a lot of solutions coming out which are very local in their outlook. So you're optimistic about the future then? You're optimistic that we might actually pull this thing off.
So I do wake up thinking, wow, we're fucked, and I look at nephews and nieces and think the risk of the world which they're going to experience. I find that very sobering. But on other days, I'm feeling very optimistic. The amount of capital that we've seen come from venture into the climate tech space this year, I think has been outstanding. I think the continuation of divestment from coal and hopefully other fossil fuels soon is a really positive step. I think those changes are happening. It's the system approach changes that I think need to happen for the necessary solutions to get off the ground. And I think maybe from now to 2025 isn't going to be comfortable. Maybe even up to 2030 is going to be still quite scary, but I think we will cross a line around 2030 because the Greta Thunbergs and other young leaders that are on the stage at COP will be in power running governments, and I think they take a much more long-term view than the politicians we have in the world today.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to end it. Listen, Dan, thanks so much for everything you're doing for the climate. It's pretty inspiring to watch you go, and it's great to be involved in it in some small capacity. And thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for your time.